Hi, everyone. Welcome to the latest installment of our ongoing editorial webinar series, Coffee Talk. Each hour-long, information-packed episode, organized by the hardworking folks at Redmond Magazine, features the observations and insights into an independent expert on a wide range of tech industry topics. Many thanks to the sponsor of this episode, Quest Software, protecting and empowering users and data, streamlining IT operations, and hardening cybersecurity from the inside out since 1987. Without their support, this series would not be possible. And thanks to you for joining us. I'm John K. Waters, Editor-in-Chief in the Converge 360 group of 1105 Media, and I'll be your moderator. Today's topic is why unified endpoint management and why now? And our lead presenter is Ian Thornton-Trump, Chief Information Security Officer at UK-based threat intelligence services provider Cyjax. Before we get going here, just a bit of housekeeping. This episode is being recorded for later access. Keep an eye out for an email with a link to that recording. It'll be coming your way in the next few days. We'll make some time during the talk for some questions. Please feel free to type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. On your attendee console, you'll see some extra resources provided by our sponsor. Be sure to check those out. And as a small thank you to the first 200 attendees who stick with us to the end, we will be sending you a $5 gift certificate to Starbucks. It's a cup of joe to go with the info. Now let me introduce our first presenter. Ian Thornton-Trump is an ITIL certified professional with 25 years of experience in IT security. His career has spanned the military intelligence branch of the Canadian Armed Forces, the Canadian Forces Military Police Reserve, and the RCMP. Yep, that's the Mounties, where he served as a criminal intelligence analyst. He has worked as a cybersecurity consultant for multinational insurance, banking, and regional healthcare organizations. He also teaches cybersecurity and IT business courses for CompTIA as part of its global faculty, and he's the lead architect for Cyber Titan, Canada's effort to encourage the next generation of cyber professionals. His research and experience have made him a sought-after expert on cyber threat intelligence programs for enterprises both large and small. He's our old friend, and we're lucky to have him. Take it away, Ian.
Thank you so much, John, and it's lovely to be back. And huge shout out to Quest for sponsoring this. And if you're going to give me a follow on socials, please consider giving Quest Software as well a follow. So let's dive right in with the iconic lines from Hackers, where you talk about how access is a mission for cyber criminals and, of course, folks that are wanting to do mischief inside your organization. We see the iconic almost MITRE attack table before MITRE attack tables were ever invented on how organizations end up getting hacked. And it's usually about something that's forgotten, something that's neglected, poor credentials on a particular system. A lot of different stuff is attached to the internet at businesses today. Some of it is very poorly secured. Some of it is readily exploitable. And this threat landscape is always changing. And we have seen all sorts of really interesting ways that lateral movement can take place within an organization that has an exposed vulnerability, and mischief ensues. And I want to point out a couple of really interesting things. Now, this was a huge kind of interesting hack that Darktrace brought to our attention about an internet-connected fish tank thermometer in a casino that was essentially responsible for an exfiltration attempt of the High Roller database. Now, how in the world does this type of thing happen? But that's exactly that. And I'm going to give you tons of examples of where the management of these devices, especially IoT, has become a major problem to the point where the Department of Justice has been seeking indictments and John Doe warrant activities against vulnerable devices that are on, in general, American networks and patching them for you. And these two have pretty interesting historical issues behind them. So the Microsoft Exchange Server vulnerabilities, this was a situation where organizations were left wide open in the wake of the SolarWinds hack, where key components of Microsoft Exchange were lifted from Microsoft when a nation-state level attackers got access to some Microsoft code repository and leveraged that into a number of 0 days that targeted on-premise Exchange servers. I got onto great debate on Twitter of whether or not on-premise Exchange servers are now at a level of unacceptable risk within the organization. Now, I tend to believe that given the current state of affairs, there are still business cases where on-premise Exchange is required, but I do agree that it's elevating the risk level mostly due to the fact that the code base that Microsoft Exchange Server is based on is, well, in a word, pretty ancient. And I do believe that there are a number of use cases, especially in small, medium businesses, where you actually do need some sort of SMTP capability, Simple Mail Transport Protocol, in order to consume data that is being generated by legacy systems. So they're down, but they're not out. And I think, as an example that we've seen recently, there are pros and cons. We've had a number of outages of Outlook Live as a result, allegedly, of either Microsoft pushing a patch, or if you follow the threat actors, Anonymous Sudan taking out the capabilities of Microsoft using little more than a tethered cell phone in support of Russian threat actors. So this is a really interesting space to watch. Now, just during the hostilities of the Ukraine-Russia war, there was another move by the Department of Justice to patch WatchGuard firewalls because they had an exploitable vulnerability and then were recruited by Russian botnets that were ostensibly going to conduct denial service attacks on behalf of Russia in support of the offensive in the early part of the Ukraine. Now, we've seen the temperatures rise in the Ukraine lately with the beginnings, perhaps, of the counteroffensive that was widely anticipated, and we have seen a big uptick in Russian-affiliated and Russian cyber operations. So the threat landscape is ever-changing, and in these two examples, undefended infrastructure becomes subjected to a relentless cyber attack, which then can lead, and certainly did in the case of the Exchange servers, to ransomware outbreaks within organizations. Quite possibly, the largest outbreak was found by a company called Rackspace when several thousands of customers hosted Exchange servers within Rackspace were compromised. So that was just sort of all the news that's fit to print and kind of up to date with the latest threat landscape. But this is really understanding how organizations that attempt to exploit are doing it by finding those unguarded, those unmanaged, or those neglected ways in, and unique ways in the organizations, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. But I wanted to go big picture here, okay? Big picture right now, I threw the Gartner Magic Quadrant in for unified endpoint management tools. This is a trend that needs to be on your radar. And when we started discussing kind of where I was going to go content-wise, I have to admit that the number of solutions that were here on the Magic Quadrant for Gartner is not indicative of the amount of solutions that are out in the marketplace. As a managed service provider CTO, UEM tools have been around for a really long time. In the MSP world, they call them remote management tools, RMM, which have now expanded into a number of platforms. Now, interestingly enough, Microsoft has been following in this trend for quite some time. And although they claim that Windows, Android, and iOS devices protected by Microsoft Intune grew over 60% year on year, that was back in a Q3 2022 earnings call. There's two fundamental issues here with all of these manufacturers of UEM tools as they appear on the Magic Quadrant, and they are complicated. They are usually really heavy on endpoints, and that legacy support may be really questionable. So if you have use cases and you have budget constraints, you absolutely need to follow this trend, but you may want to explore offerings from our sponsor like Quest, which I'm going to pull up some information about them very shortly, because you may not need to pay for all the things. And there is a trend right now where the total cost of ownership of these particular tool sets is difficult to understand because it's now tied in a lot of cases to Microsoft's licensing. And to get the functionality that your business needs, to want to go through a UEM, a tool set, and start using that kind of console, because according to Gartner, by 2025, 90% of you folks will be using UEM tools, if you can believe that. So now is absolutely the time. But this is actually following on a much bigger trend. And I sort of call it the Convergence 3-act play. And if you'll indulge me for a moment, I'm going to sort of walk you through where I'm feeling it. So the first big convergence that we had was around, I would say, 2015, oddly enough, at the beginnings of the ransomware epidemics. But we had a convergence in security of the physical realm, so traditionally guns, gates, dogs, cameras, and cyber, with the realization that without robust cyber, well, all of the physical things that security things that we have, from alarm panels to access control to all of those things, would be at jeopardy if our cybersecurity was not robust. Then what we saw was a continued relationship between IT and OT systems that had become more complex, internet connected and internet abled and networked, and that the IT realm of the house presented a risk to the OT. Now, I've been on a lot of sort of editorial calls, and so far I haven't, other than an unfortunate incident where ransomware allegedly claimed the life of an individual that was in a German hospital, we haven't had a direct cyber attack that has resulted in a mass casualty incident. It's not to say that that could not happen, but so far we've either been very lucky or that the physical safeguards like relief valves that aren't connected to the internet and not controlled by the internet but are a physical prevention device are holding and in place. Now, we've had some near misses. There's no question about that. They've been widely publicized. But I feel that the culture of OT has permeated IT, and we now sort of have a very clear picture of safety first, okay? That is a really interesting paradigm because it's led to sort of the third thing that we're seeing, which is unification. Ultimately, single infrastructure, single agent, single unified console to bring together configuration management and lifecycle and vulnerability management and all of those things that you see on the green side there, asset discovery, software distribution, patch management, etc., and the activities that we basically have with the security role that is inside an organization. Now, I think unification is really a good thing, and I do believe now that the convergence is being driven, that there is a convergence between IT operations and security operations. And we see this from the way Microsoft has designed their tools. Now, let's be clear, what you're looking at here is the whole enchilada, the whole enterprise view of things. This is expensive for small and medium businesses to adopt because it's really dependent on your licensing, how much Azure Cloud your business can afford to use, and that those costs will continue to go up. And they're hidden costs as well because they're actually, the cost of this stuff, of a lot of this stuff, is tied directly to the Microsoft licensing, which used to be in the wheelhouse of the IT department. But now, in order to get the security things, the IT department and the security department have to work hand in hand in the Microsoft world. Not necessarily a bad thing, but it's a complex thing. Because you can't really do endpoint security without Azure AD GPO policies or on-premise local security policies. But at the same time, you can't consume the data from endpoints if you don't have some sort of SIEM technology that Microsoft so conveniently provides to you as a result of this licensing model. So it's really now difficult to figure out whose budget you're taking things from, what value it's going to provide, and of course, there's a huge issue around the ease of use of some of these technologies, which in of themselves can be very complex, and you're paying your Microsoft expert to Google a lot of stuff on whatever the thing we used to call TechNet is. Because I remember one of the things that I always used to joke is once you had your MCSE, you would spend most of your days Googling for knowledge-based articles in order to figure out what the heck was going on. So this to a certain extent, I think, still exists. And I think from my perspective, I'm seeing an increasing trend to try and bring IT operations and IT security together to prevent a war between the CTO and the CISO at the cyber table. And I think the intent here is to really eliminate the gaps and the silos that a threat actor can move into in an organization. And so Microsoft is trying to sell us a unified console. And to try and figure out a way by leveraging their tool set in order to drive more automation. This isn't necessarily a bad thing in a zero trust world to drive more automation and orchestration, but the issue that we have right now, I think, is more of the visibility. We still have gaps in seeing what we're seeing out there. And what Microsoft calls out in the blog post that I stole some of this stuff from, which is highlighted in the PowerPoint presentation, there is a requirement to upskill the staff on these tools continuously because Microsoft is innovating at a very rapid pace and stuff is coming out on a constant basis, and Microsoft likes to change the names of everything every couple of years. So once one tool set comes out and you know it really, really well, guess what? The entire UI could change on you, again, making it really difficult. But the idea of a one-stop shop place for IT and IT security isn't lost on you. And this is why, a lot of the times use cases for IT and security and bringing them together have to drive your product selection. Because otherwise, you're going to end up paying a lot. We used to call it shelfware, where you would buy licenses for software, but then that software over a period of time would be depreciated, but you were still paying for your licensing. I think this is where we go now, is we look at what are our use cases. Can we find a product in the marketplace that will address those use cases without breaking the bank and disguising the budget between IT must-have software like Microsoft Office and operating system licensing and your security tools? I think there's a lot of reasonable and responsible argument here to try and figure out, is this a use case-driven thing, or are we just blindly jumping on the Microsoft train and giving them all of our money? In fact, in a lot of cases, where the money is really not apparent until you get the gigantic bill. And if anybody has been following me, and in the days ahead, I'll be on a couple of other webinars talking about that very use case where Microsoft storage in particular can be a real big budget hit if you're not careful at what you're doing. Now, this is the other thing that I think is the other part of the story. We have said for a really, really long time that one of the battle spaces is the network, right? Determining anomalous behavior and setting your network to the point where it can warn you if anomalous behavior is detected. Now, that only works if you are really diligent in terms of how you deploy the corporate IoT space. And I put all of these sort of very common IT devices like printers and IP phones, IPsec, and cameras and TVs, which I think you'll find in most enterprises today. But when you start adding ERP systems to this that integrate with physical devices such as a scale, such as a label printer, we really, really need to figure out what the best practices are around how we're going to deploy this technology. Now, I will give you a little bit of insight into this particular camera here that I've called out. And this isn't a bad thing, but the default configuration of it needs to be locked down, and it needs to be locked down by a unique password. Because if someone gets into your infrastructure, most of these cameras now have a default password setting that you can get. And in fact, you can even force a remote reset of it if you can get access to it. But here's the really interesting thing. It also can be enabled to broadcast in something called real-time streaming protocol. So you can actually make this thing into a cam and basically hook up OBS, which is an open source tool, and you can see the streams from all of these cameras when they're in broadcast mode. That might be disconcerting for your organization if it's insensitive. So this brings us to the other big point that we really have to discuss, is what is your test lab? Now, going back to these devices, and I'm going to go back a ways and say these are super esoteric in what domains they need access to, how digital rights management is being managed. In some cases, Hewlett-Packard printers, in order to use an ink function capability, need to connect to the internet. They're no longer allowed to not be internet connected for your customer enhancement, and they've gotten a lot of criticism for this, because if port 9100 is addressable remotely on your printer, well, that's where you get all sorts of really unpleasant things delivered to your printer, okay? Printers should not be on the internet. And you have a choice. You can carefully segment them, but even if you segment them, you need to figure out what their normal traffic flow is. And this is where you need the test lab for all of these devices, because in order to spot anomalous behavior, you really have to understand what normal behavior is like. And this is a really important point, especially if you're dealing with legacy software, which who knows kind of what it actually needs to do and what it actually needs to connect to. Now, I say this because by default, the Windows operating systems activates all sorts of different protocols. Every Windows box has the spooling printing service activated, the workstation service activated, including the server service activated, in order to make this a much harder target and at least reduce the services that have been exploited since CVEs were invented. You need to lock these machines down. If it doesn't need to share files, you maybe need to experiment at hardening the box and removing and turning off and disabling the server service. Now, Microsoft has made some progress in lowering the attack surface with SMB v1 in the wake of WannaCry, but there are other services on the box that are running and that are exploitable. So this is something that is an absolute key, and the reason why your IT department, when you're starting to go down the road of unified console management and unified device management, you need to understand and harden that device so it isn't doing strange things on your infrastructure, because otherwise you can't tune the signal out of the noise that your SIM and your network is going to be generating. Okay, so I've ranted at you a little bit for that. Let's talk about Red Team and the things that you can do. So in the confines of this super lab that I'm getting you to build in order to enable your own security is testing these devices again, so we can harden them, where we can segment them, where we can write rules for a couple of purposes. So the first purpose is that old legacy piece of equipment, does it have an exploitable vulnerability? So in a lab setting, we're going to scan that device to see, okay, does it present a risk to our organization or not? This has to occur on a regular basis because, believe it or not, even a lot of the high-end manufacturers are releasing patches and updates, and buried in the release notes of those patches and updates is quite possibly a security issue that you might pick up by, watching the full disclosure list. But there are a number of tools, and most of these here, I think all of them here, are free, and they will help you determining what the level of risk is and what normal behavior looks like. And I think this is a critical part of your tool set now in order to enable your organization to look at this stuff in a better light. And again, so to reiterate, part of your use cases for all of this and getting to the, I would say, nirvana of a unified endpoint management console is also addressing the big risks that are in that particular room. So if you're doing external vulnerability testing and you do realize that you have apps that are either business-facing that could be compromised by a third-party actor because there's a bunch of exploits on them, I can certainly say that if you're running older versions of Red Hat or older versions of Oracle database servers and things like that, they do present a risk to the organization, and they do have to be safeguarded, and they do have to have some sort of endpoint defenses on them, as well as, I would call it, more network layer defenses, even if that means reactive defenses such as SIMs and threat and sort of threat hunting capabilities. But also, when you're looking at deploying these things, CDNs and web application firewalls are critical to be able to deflect the type of attacks that all of these free exploitation and cybersecurity capabilities are there for you in order to make sure that your infrastructure is behaving in the way that you need it to behave. And we have seen these really interesting things come out where many organizations have been succumbing to DDoS attacks. And a lot of the DDoS attacks right now can be mitigated by simply moving those services into the clouds. And I think that's another really, really important point, is that if you're in the midst of digital transformation, of having devices that are going to be cloud services devices. So when we go back to that original use case that I talked about in terms of streaming cameras, for instance, not only do they have to be segmented, not only do they have to be subject to vulnerability management, but you do need a way to detect that anomalous behavior. And that anomalous behavior has to come in the forms of a reactive approach, because you can't, put endpoint antivirus onto that. So I think, in retrospect, as I get down to the end, and we're going to open it up for a bunch of questions in a moment, there are so many things now, I think, under the hood where it has to be a collaborative effort between security and IT in order to come anywhere close to securing the organization. Because the security team generally isn't creating VLANs, nor is it requesting server images and deployments. That stuff is all sort of run, I would say, by the IT department. And this is where, we go back to the trope of security is everyone's responsibility within the organization. So I think unified endpoint management is really the key to get IT excited about doing security stuff and security excited about helping IT do the right things and secure the environment by basically taking the information they get from their test environment or even taking a poke at the development environment and then building use cases around that so that they can be really clear to IT about what normal traffic is and why it needs to be permitted from a VLAN versus not being able to get at the signal from the noise. So unified endpoint management, my friends, is actually, in my estimation, it is the thing to reduce silos and friction within your organization because it really, truly, in my mind, it's time to bring security and IT together and deliver business value to the organization. So with that, I think what we're going to do now is we've got some time for Q&A. Really, really excited to hear what you guys think.
Thank you, Ian. So we're going to get to our first Q&A here. Remember, you can type your questions into the Q&A box at any time. We'll do our best to get to all of them. So let's start with this one here from Anne. Ian, is there any hope that network-level monitoring ML will be able to determine legitimate backup activity over a data exfiltration or ransomware outbreak?
Absolutely, and this is the really cool thing. Because we invented the MITRE attack table, that breaks down threat actor activity into discrete steps, right? So what we do is if we can spot what those discrete steps are in the flow of log information coming into a SIEM, and this includes endpoint behaviors, this includes AD, this can include your mail filtering solution, all of that information can be applied to machine learning, and literally what we can do now is poke out the things that are alerts. We triage those alerts, and we might even have to kick them up to an investigation. This is, I think, a critical part. Now, there are blind spots because in a lot of cases, you have users working remotely who may be on VPN or who may not be on VPN or are just using SaaS services to do their activities. So we might have blind spots if your SaaS provider can't allow you to consume a log into your SIEM or SIM. So there are some use cases there. But I think right now, if you are consuming the telemetry from the network and through EDR or XDR solutions or some sort of managed security solutions on the endpoints, I think you've got a good chance of cutting a cyber incident off before it becomes a major threat to the business.
Okay, the questions are rolling in now. So I want to go to this question. It's a two-parter from Wahid, who's a regular attendee. Okay, where does ERD/EDR fit? And also, can we leverage IEM and SOAR to remediate some of these challenges?
So SIEM will tell you have a challenge. Okay, that's what it's designed to do. Okay, SOAR is where now you're kicking off automation, security, orchestration, and automation. This is sort of the final zero trust challenge for organizations because SOAR is really all of those things in one basket. And I think where you have to take your organization is through a journey that starts with just gaining visibility on your assets, to coin Cyjax, Chris Roberts. If you don't know what assets you have no business doing security. But I think once you get past the visibility, there are different ways to go. Endpoint detection and response is one aspect of your security, but what we've seen now is EDR is really poking at things like XDR that bring in that network activity component, behavioral-based analytics, and those type of things, and then kicking that up to see if the network traffic from a compromised endpoint is matching any of the pattern recognitions. So it's bringing it all together to do that automation piece. The orchestration is when the machine becomes self-healing and it just basically knows, okay, I'm seeing an attack on this particular piece of software that I have installed on the endpoint. I'm going to uninstall it and upgrade it right now. Now, and big cautionary tale, because if SOAR decides to do that quickly across your enterprise, you could end up bricking a legacy application from working. So there are a lot of, I'm going to say, hidden prerequisites to get to that world of where everything is a SaaS service and IT and security can just put their feet up on the desk. I think we're a long way from that day.
Okay, this one from Lynn, another frequent attendee. Any free tools for endpoint configuration and management?
Well, it's interesting. I haven't seen anything comprehensive in the open source world. And this is, I think, probably due to a lot of the complexities and the dominance of Active Directory. But I think more and more, anybody that has done work in the open source environment, Linux and Unix, the default configurations there, assuming that they're using an up-to-date version, and that's a big issue, right? But if you don't have a need for printing from an open source box, you simply don't install the cups or the printing service onto the endpoints that have that operating system, thus reducing the attack surface dramatically. And I think, this is, we could have an entirely amazing debate, John, on the whole, is open source more secure than, the Microsoft ecosystem argument. But I think in either case, if you know what you're doing in the Microsoft world and you know what you're doing in the Unix, Linux world, you can build a pretty tight ship just by spending a lot of effort and time in configuration management and scripting. So it's sort of like pick your path to adventure,
Yeah. Okay. Here's one from Jason. He's wondering, is it best to have a firewall on-prem or from your internet provider?
Yeah, this is another big debate, and I don't know, Jason, if you caught, I was talking about not web application firewalls in a previous webinar, but something called web-based firewalls. Now, there's advantages and disadvantages, and it really comes down to what those use cases are. And I'm going to go back to that because, you can spend an awful lot of money on a firewall in your organization and a lot of effort on configuration, but it's not dynamic. And I know so many organizations that have lost track of their on-premise firewalls. They literally have to buy another firewall to learn from that firewall what rules are actually effective and working in there. And so, again, this goes back to the legacy understanding we have. Personally, I like the capabilities that are found in the web-based firewall world. However, there may be some privacy concerns. There may be some security concerns. And honestly, the compliance regimes have to catch up because, like it or not, cloud is a huge reality. And, when you're using cloud-based services like, say, SQL as a service or a database as a service, how are you going to check mark box to does the database server, in quotations, have endpoint antivirus installed? Well, it's not a server anymore. It's a service, right? So there's advances in technology, and if you're really driven by things like PCI DSS, there's a classic of example where it wants the firewalls on your endpoints turned on. It wants the firewall, at your perimeter of your network. But if you're using a bunch of SaaS services to process orders like QuickBooks Online, how is that even relevant to, billing through a SaaS application like PayPal, right? So again, this is really about the use cases that you're driving. And, you can also say the more firewalls, the better. We're going to have firewalls between departments. I've seen that happen as well. And it's maybe not a bad idea if you have a bunch of public-facing stuff, like exhibits or something like that all have IT capability, and you want to firewall that off from the administration the administration network that, does, payroll and processing and box office sales, in an organization. I think it's insane to have public-facing Wi-Fi, but yet also have your business systems on the same subnet and segment. That's a terrible idea.
Fascinating. Okay, we've got another one here from Wahid. He's wondering, is no ops via AI ops possible?
I think we're beginning to see that exist, and we're going to see things that are going to blow our minds, like self-healing, a network infrastructure that automatically, will migrate and move in response to conditions that it's detected. It's going to move, I think, at a pace that we've never seen before. The only thing we have to do is really manage and put a bubble around it so it doesn't, end up hurting us more than assisting us. And this is the big issue with AI right now. Everyone's super excited about it, but it's going to invent its own use cases, and that could be deeply problematic. We'll leave AI discussion for another day, John, because you and I had a pretty interesting and heated discussion just before this.
I know. Okay, we've got a tools question here from Keith, who's wondering, in your experience, which UEM tools are better?
So, it's sort of like saying which race car is better. It's the team behind it, and it's the capabilities that you need in order to defend your infrastructure. So as an example, like when you're talking about the OT world, where it's a no touchy-touchy, no patchy-patchy environment, or you have to be very, very careful and have, a hot standby if you're patching a Rockwell device that has some sort of ancient configuration on it that's never been documented, and if you put the firmware in it and it boots up and then doesn't know what the hell it's supposed to do, that's a bad day in the OT world, right? Production is down, and that gets, the vice president of vice presidents calling you on the phone. When are you turning the refinery back on? So again, this sort of comes back down to what are your use cases, what are the crown jewels in the organization that you're trying to protect, and can you detect signal from the noise? And I think if you are looking at the product marketplace right now and you really specify what those needs are, and your go-to-market strategy is engaging with the vendors, engaging with proof of concepts in that critical testing lab that you guys should all have, right? Even if it's virtual, I'm cool with that. But man, you don't want to make a bad product decision that leaves you open to a bunch of blind spots. And I think that's, my key takeaway here is, know your tools, but also know the reason why those tools are in place, yeah?
Awesome. Thank you, Ian.